Hello, everyone. I'm Stetson Maldonado, and I'm joined here today with Tom Johnson. And we're going to be discussing how does the planting date affect your cover crop growth? A little bit of the roadmap. So we're going to go over the farm goals, requirements for germination, different plant species, planting and germination dates, post-harvest irrigation, and then Tom's going to be talking about a test plot that he did a few years ago with our pollinator brassica blend. And the last one is we'll be discussing flowering before almonds.
So first off, the most important thing is going to be how does planting date affect your farm goals? So rule of thumb, typically the longer the cover crop lives, the greater your benefits, and that'll affect all of these equally with the exception of pollinator forage. And that is because the initiation of flowering is date dependent. So the longer that cover crop is growing, you're going to get more biomass, more nitrogen fixation, water infiltration, not quite to the same extreme as just having roots in there in general is going to improve that water infiltration rate. But as roots grow larger, you will get better water infiltration. And then grazing and microbial population. So these aren't as affected directly when it comes to planting date, but once again, as I said earlier, the longer that cover crop is in the ground, the greater your benefits will be. At Seeds for Bees, we are trying to aim for flowering as early as possible. So planting in that early October date range is what we aim for when it comes to pollinator forage, and that's because we are aiming to get a cover crop to flower before or during almond bloom.
Requirements for germination. So there are a number of requirements that go into getting your seed to sprout. The top three are moisture, temperature, and sunlight. So moisture is you need to have enough water and enough seed to soil contact to get the water to go through that seed coat and into the seed itself, and that is a signal for the seed to sprout. Temperature is a big regulator of how quickly or slowly that happens. So you need to have a threshold temperature you need to achieve a threshold temperature in order for that seed to sprout in the first place. And you also need sunlight. Not every single seed needs sunlight to germinate, but a lot of them do. And the planting date can affect what signals are available for how long and when. So if you planted a lot later in the season and it's a lot colder, you're not going to have the kind of warmth that you need. You could have shorter daylight, which may affect specific species. And then moisture, if you plant before moisture is available, your seed will not sprout until it actually has received that moisture. And that can be dictated by irrigation and by rainfall. And then different species behave differently. So there's a lot of fast establishing species such as brassicas and grasses. Those ones come up really quickly. Actually, I think brassicas are one of the few species that come up before grass do. Would you agree with that, Tom?
They generally will race the grass to the surface. That's true. So
Yeah,
they
grasses.
they just have a lot of they have a lot of energy basically in their stored feed stuff for making the seed come up faster. So they will come
Mhm,
up. Grasses being a little bit more uh, ready to go to sprout.
mhm. And a lot of people will see that throughout California when you're driving and the first rains show up, you'll see grasses coming up almost immediately. They're very quick to establish. Slower establishing examples would be legumes and some forbs. So things like clover, your veg, your peas, they'll come up slower and take longer to establish. So not only does it take them more time to germinate, it takes them more time to start growing. And the length of time for germination and plant growth can affect your when you achieve establishment. And in this case, we're discussing establishment. As you can see, the plants, they're of a good size. Tom was mentioning, what did you call it? Rowing?
When you'd row a crop and you'd look down the rows and see a line of little plants out there, little green lines out there, that was usually when you would say that that crop was established.
Yeah. And then planting versus germination. So when you plant your seeds isn't always going to dictate when that plant starts to germinate. So just because the seed is in the ground doesn't mean that it's going to sprout. So say if you planted it in September, early October, but you planted it dry and there was no irrigation or there was no rain, that seed isn't going to sprout until it has that moisture. But you can also take advantage of this and get stuff planted when you have the time, but just keep in mind that that's not going to germinate until moisture is available. And then seed survival can decline over time after planting, and a lot of that's due to predation. Some people are worried about birds, but oftentimes it's ants that are taking up quite a bit of that seed. And this can be affected by how much time there is between planting and the irrigation event that got that seed to germinate. But then again, just because it's germinating doesn't mean that seed is protected. There are some seed predators that like to eat very young plants. That is something to keep in mind, that germination doesn't start until there is moisture available. And then I'll be tossing this over to Tom for the next section.
So our next section basically is we have decided that we're going to plant a cover crop and we're putting it out there. So one of the things we advocate quite often is planting early as possible. And what we're going to go here is you're generally going to put a post-harvest irrigation on. So we're kind of saying, hey, double dip that a little bit. That post-harvest irrigations refill the soil profile. It's vital for that perennial crop to go to sleep after harvest. And it affects basically the following year's crop. It helps fill out some of those buds and basically get that tree ready to sleep and get that tree ready to come back out the next year, or those vines or whatever you're working with. So your distribution uniformity and your cover crop establishment, what we want to point out here is different irrigation systems are going to have a different effect on how well your cover crop is going to establish. And a flood or solid set sprinkler system basically covers the entire area of the orchard or the vineyard. And if you've got a cover crop in there, or you're going to plant a cover crop in there and you put that irrigation on, now you've got a good situation where that seed's going to have sufficient moisture to be able to sprout and get going. In micro irrigation systems, where micro sprinklers or micro sprinklers basically, how far that reaches out and how much is actually reaching the actual edges of those distribution patterns is going to have something to do with how well what that stand is going to look like initially. Your cover crop stand is going to look initially. I have seen them sometimes where it does reach out there and there's a dry line down the middle where it's not quite reaching the middle, but you've got green on the sides. Well, it'll all catch up over time. It's just going to look funny for a little bit. If you're in a drip only system, you are basically going to be farming two climates. You have a irrigated climate underneath your trees or your vines, and you have a dry land climate in between. So the dry land climate's going to have to wait till there's sufficient moisture to germinate seeds. People have been known to move drip lines and put them in the middle to get their cover crop established. It's a lot of effort, and you really kind of want to think about doing that type of thing if you're going to do it. Long and hard as to how much you're going to do of that, but it can be done. Is use that post-harvest irrigation as a way to provide enough moisture to get your cover crop seed to sprout. And so anyways, the test plot that Stetson mentioned earlier, I ran just a check basically over 3 different falls back in 22, 21, and 23, I believe it was. But what we wanted to know was we were always trying to get our brassica cover crop to bloom as early as possible, because we're trying to match the flowering brassica with the almonds, at least, so that the bees will have a more diverse diet to work with. They'll have more than just the almonds to work on. So what we wanted to know was, when do we need to get that established or germinated? So the idea is all 3 of these falls were very dry, and I had dry soil to work with. So I would go out, plant the cover crop seed into the soil and cause it to germinate by putting an irrigation on it. And I did that about every 2 weeks, starting in October. And so October the first time, and started earlier than that after that, and went a little bit longer. It got, as time goes on. And then basically observed the plots to see when the first flowers would show up per irrigation date. In general, it was about 70 days post harvest, no matter when we irrigated it, or post 70 days post irrigation, that we started to see a few of the very earliest brassicas in the brassica mix start to flower. So 2 to 2.5 months after, and it didn't matter whether it was the early October or September planting and irrigation date, or it was even so long as into late November, basically. It still took about that long. So that kind of told me that the plants, that was their window. They weren't necessarily going to bloom much earlier, but they bloomed earlier if I could, or that many days post emergence, but they would bloom earlier if we could get them established earlier. So this kind of proved that if we can get that brassica cover crop germinated, irrigated to make cause germination and establishment in October prior or even prior to the middle of November, we can generally get some flowering out there in that orchard at the same time as the almonds are coming to flower. Okay.
And then I was also wanting you to point out how it wasn't always perfect when the differences between the planting date, such as the October 7th in 2021 to the October 8th in 2022.
Yeah, no 2 years are ever the same, and most growers understand this. So the other factors going on in this type of thing is not only did we water it and cause it to come up, and it came up at varying rates year to year, but basically the flowering, the temperatures and the amount of daylight and so on and so forth, once the little plants were up and growing, probably had quite a bit to do with how well that could get going and get blooming. So again, we had in 22 here, we've watered it on October 7th, and we saw the first flowers out there about the end of December. That's the first flower. That's not full flower, but there's flowers starting to show up. The next year, October 8th, it was mid-January before we started seeing the first flowers. The year after that, we were back to early October planting and watering. We were about the end of December showing it. So the temperature during the growing season is going to have a certain temperature, and probably daylight is going to have a certain amount to do with how soon we start to see flowers. Full flowering generally started about 2 weeks after we saw the first flowers. So you'd see a few flowers out there. Sometimes it looks like a lot, sometimes it's not so much, but the full bloom would usually take about 2 weeks. So it would ramp right up after it got started. So we were almost always able to hit flowering during our almond bloom as well. And our brassicas flowering about the same time as our almonds were blooming. So that was the goal. And that was why I also drew the line at about the end of November. Was experience that taught me that after that, everything slows down by a week at least in just coming out of the ground. And that drag alone is going to carry through to the tail end of the season. So flowering before almonds, which is kind of our main thing on this Seeds for Bees program, is we're trying to get flowers out there to benefit our honeybees. It's particularly important in our almonds because they're one of the first pollinated crops of the season. They come out first, and the bees that arrived are just coming out of hibernation or cold storage or just being asleep all winter, basically. So what's really important is almonds are a very good source of forage for bees, but they need some diversity as well. So having those mustards flowering out there at approximately the same time is going to help them have a diverse diet and generally boost the productivity of the hive. So it does improve our bee health, and it potentially boosts productivity. The old wives' tale, well, the bees are going to be in my cover crop, they're not going to be in my trees, is been shown that that's not a problem. Almonds are generally the almond bloom is usually a little more attractive. So the bees will service that before, once they start flying in the morning, they'll service the trees. Then they go looking for something else. So that was why having another thing blooming in that field potentially at the same time is not necessarily going to hurt the almond crop, but it's sure going to help the bees out. So anyways, thank you for joining us today. We want to thank our donors. Seeds for Bees is entirely funded by generous donations of individuals and corporations. That makes this program stackable with both federal and state grants. It doesn't interfere with that type of funding, basically. And we're deeply grateful to the people who make our program possible, many of whom have been with Seeds for Bees since its inception. Thank you again.